Hi, history friends. Welcome to Miss Smart Classroom. I'm Miss Smart, and today we'll be having, as usual, an history talk. And we'll be talking about the amelioration proposal. And what was the amelioration proposal? What were the steps or the clause of the amelioration proposal? What was the purpose of the amelioration proposal? And why was the amelioration proposal put in place? The reason that the West Indian interest and also the Society for the Abolition of Slavery, why did they accept this proposal? Now, the amelioration proposal was supposed to be something that would help to improve the conditions of the slaves. In addition to improving the living condition of the slave, it also delay emancipation. And these were one of the reasons why it came into place. Now, if you are here listening about the amelioration proposal, it means that you already should have known about the arguments for and against slavery, and you would have been aware that in England there was a body called the Society of Gradual Abolition of Slave Trade, otherwise known as the London Society for the Gradual Abolition of Slave Trade, and these persons were campaigning for emancipation. They were campaigning for the end of slavery. These persons would include persons such as Thomas Buxton, who were the same persons who were instrumental in getting the slave trade ended. So we're talking about the 1820s at this time. Slave trade had come to an end, and the society is actively working on putting slavery to an end. So the slave trade ended before slavery ended. And now the society was putting forward their own amelioration proposal to improve the life of the slaves and to gradually end slavery and to bring about an abolition to slavery. However, the West Indian interests, who are the persons who are the farmers and the planters and the overseers who wanted slavery to continue because it gave them profit, and it was slaves were their investment, they form a group called the West Indian Interest or the West Indian Lobby, and they wanted to protect and safeguard, ensuring that slavery did not come to an end. And so they put forward their own amelioration proposal. It had around 15 clauses, and the members of the Society for the Abolition of Slavery, they were okay with the clause and terms and condition of the amelioration proposal because it really, in theory, was to improve the way the slaves were treated and their lifestyle. And so it came into effect, and it was something that was supposed to be beneficial. Now, these are the clauses of the bill that was passed, and I will be telling you them. The first one is that female slaves should no longer be flogged. So we know that slaves were punished greatly with whips and flogging, but the law is that female slaves should no longer be flogged under the amelioration proposal. It also said that there should be a time period between the punishment and the activity. So for the male slaves who would be flogged, there should be at least 24 hours or some time gap between when the offense was done and when the flogging was done. And I think this was because, it gives you time to be less emotional and less angry, and hopefully the punishment would fit the crime better or would be less. Now, as we move on, it says that all flogging should be recorded. Yes, all flogging, I wanted it over 3 flogging, it should be recorded and submitted to the magistrate on a quarterly basis. This is supposed to help them to monitor the harshness and the cruelty and to how often they flag and to the amount of flagging that they give, because they were supposed to tell the crime, tell the amount of flagging that was given. And so this should have helped to give them accountability and hopefully made the slave's life a little easier. Next, it says that slave families should not be separated and slaves should not be sold for payments. Because prior to the amelioration proposal, slave families were not saved. You could be separated from your children, from your mother, from your spouse, from your whoever you are close to. You'll be separated. Matter of fact, slave family was not encouraged prior, especially in the British Caribbean. But now, after within the 1820s and moving forward with the amelioration proposal, it is saying do not separate slave families. Keep them together, and you cannot sell your slave just because you're in debt. You cannot exchange your slave to clear off your debt. That was no longer allowed, and religious interest was now placed that the slaves should be provided with spiritual guidance, and so they're supposed to be provided with spiritual instruction at the expense of the government if necessary. So they were saying to teach them about the Bible, properly convert them, allow them to go to church, because this was important to them. And the slaves were not able to give evidence in the law against their owners. This was not done before. Before this time, slave could not be character reference. Slaves were not allowed to really go up and say this person did this thing or testify against their masters. A black person wasn't allowed to testify against a white person. But with the amelioration proposal, it is saying they should, because the amelioration proposal was trying to establish slaves to be persons and not property, as they were viewed as within the British Caribbean. So in addition to that, slave should be able to save. Slaves should be encouraged to have bank accounts and to save and to buy their own personal possessions. No, I'm sure many of you are asking where the slaves getting these money from, but there were such thing as jobbing slaves, and these were like the skilled slaves who were able to go out and work off the plantation, and they would get some stipend for that. And then slaves would also sell their provision in the marketplace on a Saturday, and so whatever little money they get from that, they were encouraged to open a bank account, save, and to be able, because they were somewhat practicing for emancipation, and so it should give them some sense of independence. Next, it says that all children born after 1824 should be emancipated. It's our 1823 should be emancipated. And those who remain in bondage should be protected from abuse. So with the Amelioration Act, children born after 1823 were supposed to be set free. But of course, they were going to still be living on the plantation because their parents weren't free. Their parents were still very much in captivity, and they were going to be working to help to feed themselves. And for those who, for some reason, weren't free, there are other children who weren't free. Those children shouldn't be protected from abuse. And slaves should be encouraged to get married. And slaves should be given the right to go to church on Saturday and to go to church on Sunday and go to the market on Saturday. And overseers should stop carrying whips into the fields. These were pretty much the 15 clauses of the amelioration proposal. I hope you'll be able to at least remember 10 of these clauses as you will write on them, as you will be able to elaborate how did this impacted the lives of the slaves and what it was in theory. Now, the proposal which outlined the flogging of women and the separation of family, those which encourage slave marriage and provided freeing children after 1823 were obviously designed to benefit women and children. So those benefited women and children. And so those were the benefits to women and children. So you might be asking, why would the West Indian interests, the persons who want slaves, the persons who view their slaves as property, and the persons who really and truly didn't care about the slaves, why were they okay with this bill. First and foremost, they proposed the bill. Why did they propose the bill, and why? What was their reason for it? And the reason is they wanted to appease the humanitarian issue. They wanted to appease those that were saying, because slavery is inhumane, because slavery is cruel, we should end it. So by doing this, they're showing the humanitarians that we're making it more humane, we're making it more flexible, we are, you know. And so that was one. And they also wanted to undermine the efforts of the abolitionists. So the abolitionists are saying slavery is cruel, slavery is humane, this is what's happening. Because some of the excuse that they gave was that children were enslaved, women were treated badly, that they were whipped, and that there was no care for their savings and for their welfare and for their Christianity. So by putting these deliberate 15 things in measures, you're saying, okay, we heard you, we're fixing what you have to say, you can stop the campaigning now. We are not as bad as you say we are, we're fixing the system. And so that was one of the reasons. And one of the main reasons, of course, they wanted to prolong slavery. They wanted to prolong slavery for as long as possible. And so by doing this, they are prolonging slavery, because the West Indian interest was aware that with the abolition of the slave trade, eventually there would be an abolition of slavery, and they wanted to improve the condition under which slaves were living in order to prolong the lifespans of their slaves as much as possible. And remember, they couldn't buy any more slaves, so they really needed their slaves to be living a little longer. Because before the abolition of the slave trade, if slave died, you just buy more slaves. If slave run away or we whip them too harshly, we just bought more slaves because they were there as a commodity to get more. But no, you couldn't legally get them, so you needed to ensure that the ones you have, you preserve them, you keep them somewhat satisfied, somewhat happy, somewhat well kept, so that their lifespan will be a little longer. And so that was one of the reasons. In addition, they realized that the planters were now vulnerable, in a vulnerable condition, and they had to encourage themselves in some way. You understand? They were left in a vulnerable condition. They were left in a place where they, one, lost their supply of slaves, and two, there was this campaign to take away the supply that they had already. And there was no, so they needed to figure out a way, how do we keep the ones that we have? How do we keep them at a longer rate? And how do we slow down this campaign? The pro-slavery group were aware that as long as the living condition continued to be unacceptable, that the slaves were going to rebel. And therefore, they needed to discourage slave resistance. And so it was necessary to improve the slave life. Because slaves were always rebelling, they were always fighting, and they were going to continue to rebel, and they were going to continue to fight once they weren't being taken care of. So that was one of the reasons why the planters and overseers, which are known as the West Indian interests, were okay with the or in theory okay with the abolition movement. So let us recap. They wanted to appease the humanitarians. They wanted to undermine the abolitionists. They wanted to prolong slavery as much as possible. They were aware that with the ending of the slave trade and they cannot get any more slaves legally, they needed to do something to ensure that the lifespan of the slaves that they had extended. They were aware that they were in a vulnerable position and they wanted to somewhat make the best of it and to improve upon it. And they knew that if the slave condition continued to be deplorable and unacceptable, the slaves were going to continue to fight and to rebel. No, they're going to run the risk of not only losing their slaves, losing their own lives, but losing their investment. And for those reasons, they agreed to the amelioration proposal. Now, even though the West Indian interests agreed to the amelioration proposal, not all the planters themselves agreed nonetheless. Not all the planters themselves agreed to the amelioration proposal. Not all of them were okay with it. Now, it was an issue to get it adopted. A lot of the planters, they didn't want it because they were saying that this was only going to benefit the slaves, and that if they do these things, the slaves are going to believe that they got it right. And so they refused to publish these things, and they refused, and they you know, it would encourage the slaves to think that they have the right, and they didn't want to do this. They were against it. There were letters and newspaper articles talking and arguing that these slaves were all in favor. These clause of the amelioration proposal were all in favors of the slaves, and they fiercely resisted these things in colonies such as Dominica, and they didn't want it. And the assemblies in places like Barbados were against it. But you know what happened as a result? The slaves heard the rumors. The slaves heard the rumors, and they actually thought that it was freedom that was coming. They heard the rumors that there was something happening, and that the planters were keeping it from them. They misunderstood it and thought emancipation had come early, and this would have led to rebellion in places such as Demerara and other countries. Yes, that is what's going to happen. People are going to rebel. The amelioration proposal failed. It failed because it was not implemented properly. It failed because the planters didn't want it. They didn't think that the colonies and those in America, not in America, my apologies, those in Europe, those in the mother country did not have the right to make policies for them, because they were not the one implementing these policies. They were not the one living with the consequences of these policies. And as a result, it was not successful. Britain could not force and keep it in place. And then there was not enough officials in the Caribbean to ensure and enforce the amelioration proposal. And for those who were there, they were sympathetic towards the slave owners. You understand? And the amelioration proposal, there was fear that they were going to lose their authority and control over their slaves. And so the planters' reaction to the amelioration proposal gave the anti-slavery campaign a stronger case to say, okay, see, they do not want to improve the lives of the slaves, so let us just go to full emancipation. So that was one of the effects of the planters' reaction to the emancipation proposal. Since they don't want to improve the lives of the slaves, since they don't care about the slaves, let us just go to abolition. Since they did not want to improve the condition of the slaves, and they had no intention of improving the condition of the slaves, let us just move to having a full-fledged emancipation proposal. And the amelioration proposal did not stop the anti-slavery movement. It couldn't stop the anti-slavery movement because the planters failed to implement it, because of the planters' attitude towards the amelioration proposal. And the non-conformist missionaries were active, and they were present in the Caribbean, and they saw the reports, and they gave first-hand reports about how much it was not implemented or it was disregarded. And as a result of that, the amelioration proposal did not undermine the work of the abolitionists, and the abolition proposal did not stop the abolitionists from working. It did not stop them from moving towards emancipation. And so let us recap quickly. The amelioration proposal, which was put forward in 1823, was really put forward by the West Indian interest in an effort to stop the abolitionists and to slow down the emancipation movement, because the Society of the Abolition of Slave Trades were actively working and ending slavery gradually, and so persons came together on the interest of the planters to say, okay, what can we do to ensure that emancipation doesn't come? And as a result of that, they implemented the clauses of the amelioration proposal. And once again, the clauses ranges from not flogging women to documenting the amount of flags to giving the slaves the right to own bank accounts and the right to save. It also give them the right and the privilege to go to church on Sundays and to go to the markets on Saturdays. It also says that the slaves could appeal in court. It says that they should not separate families. Children born after 1823 should be free. Those who weren't free should be protected. And these were things, simple little things to improve the lives of the slaves. And these were good things. And these were put in place because the planters themselves know that they needed to, they were in a vulnerable situation and they needed to protect the lifespan of the slaves that they had. Because those slaves, they didn't have a new supply of slaves because of the slave trade that had ended prior to. And so they needed to improve the life of the slave so that the lifespan of the slave could be longer, and also to prevent the slaves from rebelling and to slow down the abolition movement of the slaves. And for all these reasons, the abolition proposal was made, but it was not accepted. It was not implemented properly, and it failed because of the attitude of the planters. The planters thought that those in Great Britain should not be making rules for them, and they thought that it was too much in favor of the slaves. They thought that they were going to lose their authority and their command over the slaves, and so they didn't implement it. They were furious. They argued about it, and this news of this spread to the slaves, and there was a rumor that emancipation came, and it led to rebellion. It led to war. It led to persons such as in Damara fighting because they thought their freedom came. And a good effect was that because the planters were so fiercely against the amelioration proposal, it gave the abolitionists, those are the ones fighting to end slavery, a stronger case to prove that, you know what, the planters do not care about slaves, so let us just end it. And so there I've given you what is the amelioration proposal, the reason why the West Indian interests agreed to the amelioration proposal. I've also given you the clauses of the amelioration proposal, what was the reaction and consequences and result of the amelioration proposal. All the best.